Thomas advanced with the archers of the left-hand battle, and they had not gone more than 20 yards when, just beyond a ditch, a bank, and some newly planted blackthorn saplings, they were forced to their right because a great scoop had been taken out of the ridge's flank to leave a hollow of ground with sides too steep for the plough. The hollow was filled with bracken that had turned yellow, and at its far side was a lichen-covered stone wall, and Thomas's arrow bag caught and tore on a rough piece of the coping as he clambered across. Only one arrow fell out, but it dropped into a mushroom fairy ring, and he tried to work out whether that was a good or a bad omen, but the noise of the Scottish drums distracted him. He picked up the arrow and hurried on. All the enemy drummers were working now, rattling their skins in a frenzy, so that the air itself seemed to vibrate. The Scottish men-at-arms were hefting their shields, making sure they protected the pikemen, and a crossbowman was working the ratchet that dragged back his cord and lodged it on the trigger's hook. The man glanced up anxiously at the advancing English bowmen, then discarded the ratchet handles and laid a metal quarrel in the crossbow's firing trough. The enemy had begun to shout, and Thomas could distinguish some words now. "If it the English," he heard. Then a crossbow bolt hummed past him, and he forgot about the enemy chant. Hundreds of English archers were advancing through the fields, most of them running. The Scots only had a few crossbows, but those weapons outranged the longer war bows of the English, who were hurrying to close that range. An arrow slithered across the grass in front of Thomas. Not a crossbow bolt, but an arrow from one of the few Scottish yew bows, and the sight of the arrow told him he was almost in range. The first of the English archers had stopped and drawn back their cords, and then their arrows flickered into the sky. A bowman in a padded leather jerkin fell backwards, with a crossbow bolt embedded in his forehead. Blood spurted skywards, where his last arrow, shot almost vertically, soared uselessly. "Aim at the archers!" a man in a rusted breastplate bellowed. "Kill their archers first!" Thomas stopped and looked for the standard. It was off to his right, a long way off, but he had shot at further targets in his time, and so he turned and braced himself, and then, in the name of God and St. George, he put his chosen arrow onto the string and drew the white goose feathers back to his ear. He was staring at King David II of Scotland, saw the sun glint gold off the royal helmet, saw too that the king's visor was open, and he aimed for the chest, nudged the bow right to compensate for the wind, and loosed. The arrow went true, not vibrating as a badly made arrow would, and Thomas watched it climb and saw it fall, and saw the king jerk backwards, and then the courtiers closed about him, and Thomas laid his second arrow across his left hand and sought another target. A Scottish archer was limping from the line, an arrow in his leg. The men-at-arms closed about the wounded man, sealing their line with heavy shields. Thomas could hear hounds baying deep among the enemy formation. Perhaps he was hearing the war howl of the tribesmen. The king had turned away, and men were leaning towards him. The sky was filled with the whisper of flying arrows, and the noise of the bows was a steady, deep music. The French called it the devil's harp music. There were no Scottish archers left that Thomas could see. They had all been made targets by the English bowmen, and the arrows had ripped the enemy archers into bloody misery. So now the English turned their missiles on the men with pikes, swords, axes, and spears. The tribesmen, all hair and beard and fury, were beyond the men-at-arms, who were arrayed 6 or 8 men deep, so the arrows rattled and clanged on armour and shields. The Scottish knights and men-at-arms and pike-carriers were sheltering as best they could, crouching under the bitter steel rain, but some arrows always found the gaps between the shields, while others drove clean through the leather-covered willow boards. The thudding sound of the arrows hitting shields was rivaling the sharper noise of the drums. "Forward, boys, forward!" One of the archers' leaders encouraged his men to go 20 paces nearer the enemy so that their arrows could bite harder into the Scottish ranks. "Kill them, lads!" 2 of his men were lying on the grass, proof that the Scottish archers had done some damage before they were overwhelmed with English arrows. Another Englishman was staggering as though he were drunk, weaving back towards his own side and clutching his belly, from which blood trickled down his leggings. A bow's cord broke, squirting the arrow sideways as the archer swore and reached under his tunic to find a spare. The Scots could do nothing now. They had no archers left, and the English edged closer and closer, until they were driving their arrows in a flat trajectory that whipped the steel heads through shields, mail, and even the rare suit of plate armor. Thomas was scarce 70 yards from the enemy line and choosing his targets with cold deliberation. He could see a man's legs showing under a shield, and he put her through the thigh. The drummers had fled, and 2 of their instruments, their skins split like rotten fruit, lay discarded on the turf. A nobleman's horse was close behind the dismounted ranks, and Thomas put a missile deep into the destrier's chest, and when he next looked, the animal was down, and there was a flurry of panicking men trying to escape its thrashing hooves, and all of those men, exposing themselves by letting their shields waver, went down under the sting of the arrows, and then a moment later a pack of a dozen hunting dogs, long-haired, yellow-fanged and howling, burst out of the cowering ranks and were tumbled down by the slicing arrows. "Is it always this easy?" a boy, evidently at his first battle, asked a nearby archer. "If the other side don't have archers," the older man answered, "and so long as our arrows last, then it's easy. After that it's shit hard." Thomas drew and released, shooting at an angle across the Scottish front to whip a long shaft behind a shield and into a big man's face. The Scottish king was still on his horse, but protected now by 4 shields that were all bristling with arrows, and Thomas remembered the French horses labouring up the Picardy slope with the feather-tipped shafts sticking from their necks, legs and bodies. He rummaged in his torn arrow bag, found another missile, and shot it at the king's horse. The enemy was under the flail now, and they would either run from the arrow storm or else, enraged, charge the smaller English army, and, judging by the shouts coming from the men behind the arrow-stuck shields, Thomas suspected they would attack. He was right. He had time to shoot one last arrow, and then there was a sudden terrifying roar, and the whole Scottish line, seemingly without anyone giving an order, charged. They ran howling and screaming, stung into the attack by the arrows, and the English archers fled. Thousands of enraged Scotsmen were charging, and the archers, even if they shot every arrow they possessed in the advancing horde, would be overwhelmed in a heartbeat, and so they ran to find shelter behind their own men-at-arms. Thomas tripped as he climbed the stone wall, but he picked himself up and ran on, then saw that other archers had stopped and were shooting at their pursuers. The stone wall was holding up the Scots, and he turned round himself and put 2 arrows into defenceless men before the enemy surged across the barrier and forced him back again. He was running towards the small gap in the English line where St. Cuthbert's mast-cloth waved, but the space was choked with archers trying to get behind the armoured line, and so Thomas went to his right, aiming for the sliver of open ground that lay between the army's flank and the ridge's steep side. "Shields forward!" A grizzled warrior, his helmet visor pushed up, shouted at the English men-at-arms. "Brace hard! Brace hard!" The English line, only 4 or 5 ranks deep, steadied to meet the wild attack, with their shields thrust forward and right legs braced back. "St. George! St. George!" a man called. "Hold hard now! Thrust hard and hold hard!" Thomas was on the flank of the army now, and he turned to see that the Scots, in their precipitate charge, had widened their line. They had been arrayed shoulder to shoulder in their first position, but now, running, they had spread out, and that meant their westernmost sheltron had been pushed down the ridge's slope and into the deep hollow that so unexpectedly narrowed the battleground. They were down in the hollow's bottom, staring up at the skyline, doomed. "Archers!" Thomas shouted, thinking himself back in France and responsible for a troop of Wilskeat's bowmen. "Archers!" he bellowed, advancing to the hollow's lip. "Now kill them!" Men came to his side, yelped in triumph, and drew back their cords. Now was the killing time, the archers' time. The Scottish right wing was down in the sunken ground, and the archers were above them and could not miss. 2 monks were bringing their sheaves of arrows, each sheaf holding 24 shafts, evenly spaced about 2 leather discs that kept the arrows apart, and so protected their feathers from being crushed. The monks cut the twine holding the arrows, and spilt the missiles on the ground beside the archers, who drew again and again, and killed again and again, as they shot down into the pit of death. Thomas heard the deafening crash as the men-at-arms collided in the field's centre. But here, on the Scots were in the low ground, the archers were on the lip of the hill, and death was their dominion. The arrows were flashing straight down the slope, scarce any arc in their flight, and striking home with the sound of cleavers hitting flesh. The Scots writhed and died in the hollow, and the yellow autumn bracken turned red. Some of the enemy tried to climb towards their tormentors, but they became the easiest targets. Some attempted to escape up our side and were struck in the back, while some fled down the hill in ragged disarray. Sir Thomas Rugby, Sheriff of Yorkshire and commander of the English left, saw their escape and ordered 20 of his men to mount their horses and scour the valley. The mailed riders swung their swords and morning stars to finish the archers' bloody work. The base of the hollow was a writhing, bloody mass. A man in plate armor, a plumed helmet on his head, tried to climb out of the carnage, and 2 arrows whipped through his breastplate, and a third found a slit in his visor, and he fell back, twitching. A thicket of arrows jutted from the falcon on his shield. The arrows became fewer now, for there were not many Scotsmen left to kill, and then the first archers scrambled down the slope with drawn knives to pillage the dead and kill the wounded. "Who hates the English now?" one of the archers jeered. "Come on, you bastards, let's hear you! Who hates the English now?" Then a shout sounded from the centre. "Archers! To the right! To the right!" The voice had a note of sheer panic. "To the right! For God's sake, now!" The men-at-arms of the English left were scarcely engaged in the fight because the archers were slaughtering the Scots in the low bracken. The English centre was holding firm, for the Archbishop's men were arrayed behind a stone wall which, though only waist-high, was a more than adequate barrier against the Scottish assault. The invaders could stab, lunge and hack over the wall's coping, and they could try to climb it, and they could even try to pull it down stone by stone, but they could not push it over, and so they were checked by it, and the English, though far fewer, were able to hold, even though the Scots were lunging at them with their heavy pikes. Some English knights called for their horses, and, once mounted and armed with lances, pressed up close to their beleaguered comrades and rammed the lances at Scottish eyes. Other men-at-arms ducked under the unwieldy pikes and hacked with swords and axes at the enemy, and all the while the long arrows drove in from the left. The noise in the centre was the shouting of men in the rearward ranks, the screaming of the wounded, the clangour of blade on blade, the crack of blade on shield, and the clatter of lance on pike, but the wall meant that neither side could press the other back, and so, crammed against the stones and encumbered by the dead, they just lunged, hacked, suffered, bled and died. But on the English right, where Lord Neville and Lord Percy commanded, the wall was unfinished, nothing more than a pile of stones that offered no obstacle to the assault of the Scottish left wing that was commanded by the Earl of March and by the King's nephew, Lord Robert Stewart. Their Sheltron, closest to the city, was the largest of the 3 Scottish divisions, and it came at the English lack of wolves who had not fed in a month. The attackers wanted blood, and the archers fled from their howling charge like sheep scattering before fangs, and then the Scots struck the English right, and the sheer momentum of their assault drove the defenders back 20 paces before, somehow, the men-at-arms managed to hold the Scots, who were now stumbling over the bodies of the men they had wounded or killed. The English, cramming themselves shoulder to shoulder, crouched behind their shields and shoved back, stabbing swords at ankles and faces and grunting with the effort of holding the vast pressure of the Scottish horde. It was hard to fight in the front ranks. Men shoved from behind so that Englishmen and Scotsmen were close as lovers, too close to wield a sword in anything except a rudimentary stab. The ranks behind had more room, and a Scotsman chopped down with a pike that he wielded like a giant axe, its blade crunching down into an enemy's head to split helmet, leather liner, scalp and as easily as an unboiled egg. Blood fountained across a dozen men as the dead soldier fell, and other Scots pushed into the gap his death had caused, and a clansman tripped on the body and screamed as an Englishman sawed at his exposed neck with a blunt knife. The pike dropped again, killing a second man, and this time, when it was lifted up, the dead man's crumpled visor was caught on the pike's bloody spike. The drums, those that were still whole, had begun their noise again, and the Scots heaved to their rhythm. "The Bruce! The Bruce!" some chanted, while others called on their patron. "St. Andrew! St. Andrew!" Lord Robert Stewart, gaudy in his blue and yellow colours, and with a thin fillet of gold about the brow of his helmet, used a two-handed sword to chop at the English men-at-arms who cowered from the rampant Scots. Lord Robert, safe from arrows at last, had lifted his visor so he could see the enemy. "Come on!" he screamed at his men. "Come! Hard into them! Kill them! Kill them!" The king had promised that the Christmas feast would be in London, and there seemed only a small screen of frightened men to break before that promise could come true. The riches of Durham, York, and London were just a few sword strokes away. All the wealth of Norwich and Oxford, of Bristol and Southampton, was only a handful of deaths from Scottish purses. "Scotland! Scotland! Scotland!" Lord Robert called. "Scotland!" And the pikeman, because the trap visor was obstructing his blade, was beating on a man's helmet with the hook side of his weapon's head, not chopping through the metal but smashing it, hammering the broken helmet into the dying man's brain so that blood and jelly oozed from the visor's slits. An Englishman screamed as a Scottish spike struck through his mail into his groin. A boy, perhaps a page, reeled back with his eyes bloodied from a sword slash. "Scotland!" Lord could smell the victory now. So close. He shoved on, felt the English line jar and moved back, saw how thin it was, fended off a lunge with his shield, stabbed with his sword to kill a fallen and wounded enemy, shouted at his squires to keep a watch for any rich English noblemen whose ransom could enrich the House of Stuart. Men grunted as they stabbed and hacked. A tribesman reeled from the fight, gasping for breath, trying to hold his guts inside his slashed belly. A drummer was beating the Scots on. "Bring my horse!" Lord Robert called to a squire. He knew that the beaten English line had to break in a moment, and then he would mount, take his lance, and pursue the beaten enemy. "On! On!" he shouted. "On!" And the man wielding the long hafted pike, the huge Scotsman who had driven a gap into the English front rank, and who seemed to be carving a bloody path south all by himself, suddenly made a mewing noise. His pike, high in the air where it was fouled with the bent visor, faltered. The man jerked, and his mouth opened and closed again, but he could not speak, because an arrow, its white feathers bloodied, jutted from his head. An arrow, Lord Robert saw, and suddenly the air was thick with them, and he pulled down the visor of his helmet so that the day went dark. The damned English archers were back.